Muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to everyone who's here today, everyone who's following live through our webpage for the Peace Institute. We are so pleased to be able to coordinate and organize this event alongside the Colombian Embassy here in the United States and the search unit of disappeared persons or missing persons. It's such a pleasure to highlight this effort to search for missing persons in Colombia. My name is Steve Hege. I am the director for the Institute of Peace in Colombia. For those who do not or who are not familiar with us, we are a public entity, but we are independent of the executive branch, like the Congress of the United States, in order to prevent, mitigate, and reduce armed conflict all over the world. In Colombia, USIP has been operating for over 20 years, supporting different peace-building processes at both the territorial and national levels. It's a pleasure of mine to work with experts, thematic experts, to support three strategic pillars. One is armed conflict resolution and bringing support to peace processes there. Second, reform of peace processes. And thirdly, a pillar that brings us to convene this session, which is restorative justice. And within that framework, we have convened this event mainly to launch a photo exhibit, which all of you here today will be able to visit and enjoy as we exit the auditorium. It is called Still Missing: Searching for Colombia's Missing Persons Over 6 Decades of Ongoing Armed Conflict. And this shows the hard work done to find and identify the 100,000 people that have been officially categorized as lost or missing as a result of the longest armed conflict in existence today. This exhibit shows the efforts undertaken to find those missing, as well as victims and families of victims that seek to address one of the most devastating effects of armed conflict. Victims whose destiny has yet to be resolved. This exhibit pays homage to the work done by forensic investigators and social workers to exhume and identify and deliver remains in a dignified fashion to families. Through these images, we seek to bring light to all aspects of this matter. We look at the long afternoon spent exhuming common territories and vigils with those who finally meet their final resting place. There's been a lot of work done to support family members of victims of these situations, and we have inspired them in their search for their missing family members. Although we do not always help to return bodies, we can construct truth around an individual's final moments, and families often thereby are able to assuage their agony. As for efforts by search units, make use of different sources of information, including consultations with individuals who have accepted responsibility for atrocities that were at one point part of armed forces, including the FARC guerrillas. Now, looking at special jurisdiction for peace and differential sanctions, these efforts are crucial to find common ground and bring clarity to families on the situations of their forced, disappeared loved ones. This is all part of our principle for restorative justice. Colombia has been a pioneering nation in this regard in implementing a transitional justice system. After a long preparatory process and moving meetings, we facilitate reunions between victims and those who were either directly or indirectly responsible for their suffering. In some cases, ex-military members and members of the FARC have joined search efforts alongside family members of their very own victims. They narrate what they remember and know about a person's murder or the burial of their remains. We also work in negotiation or peace negotiation processes in the country. And unfortunately, year after year, thousands of Colombians remain in a disappeared context every single year. The mandate is limited officially to acts previous to 2016 when the peace agreement with the FARC was established, but our technical efforts make major contributions to clarifying and preventing current cases. Now, before beginning with today's agenda, I would like to invite Ambassador and head of the mission for the Embassy of Colombia here in the United States, who will be sharing some opening remarks as well. Daniel Avilar. Good afternoon. It is such an honor to see familiar faces at this event. What better place to welcome Dr. Luz Janeth Forero, who is the director for the search unit for individuals, for the missing person search unit. On behalf of Ambassador Daniel García-Peña, we would like to thank Steve and the entire working team for the unwavering efforts you undertake in Colombia to support our peace process in the country. So thank you so much to Steve, his team, and the entire institute that leads this effort. I also want to recognize Ambassador Van Schaack, a longtime friend of Colombia. Thank you for your efforts, the efforts that you've undertaken over so long to build peace in the country. So I would like to reiterate the appreciation my national government has for your efforts. We are so grateful to your work and your team. The unit is one of the results of the peace agreement of 2016. It's an extrajudicial and humanitarian effort for justice, reparation, and non-repetition. This is the comprehensive system for peace, which has been integrated in our peace frameworks and for the purposes of clarifying these matters. I want to highlight the work of Luz Janeth Forero and the work that her team has done, not just in building trust among communities where they are present, in deep Colombia as well, which is part of our mandate with the national government, but also the work that you advance through your mission to build peace in our country. The president's government is committed to these peace efforts, and you are well aware of this, that the pillars we've been working on are fundamental to our work.
I won't go into detail, but our peace accord from 2016 continues to be a very important effort. We know the dialogue that has taken place and the efforts that's been carried out with the ELN and the other groups that the president has proposed to advancing on to be able to reach total peace in our national territory. In regards to the peace accord from 2016, I take this moment to refer to the last visit of our Councilor Murillo and the Minister of the Interior, Cristo, in New York. Their purpose was to inform the United Nations of a new agenda that's being established, a new agenda and Schaack plan to be able to really cement the peace accord from 2016 with including 6 pillars with a roadmap, interinstitutional cooperation and monitoring. Without a doubt, this is a job and an effort that we as a national government wish to continue implementing. We wish to contributing to our country with this huge accomplishment. And this is thanks to our President Pedro's leadership and his entire team. We continue to cooperate with the U.S. to continue to apply the U.S. The peace accord. There are several projects that we have received help from the USIP, the Department of State, and among other institutions. Many important projects such as reconciliation, preventing conflict and stabilization, justice, inclusive development, and peaceful living or coexistence, as well as including a variety of ethnic and racial groups, resilience of the communities that have been affected by violence, and sustainable and development for rural areas and other areas. It is fundamental to acknowledge and highlight that the support of the United States through these projects has led to a huge impact and change locally for those communities in their search for peace. Lincoln's visit in 2002 in Colombia also was a huge achievement, a very big milestone, since he confirmed that the U.S. would be a partner in the peace accord efforts or peace agreement efforts. We've been working hand in hand thanks to the support that the U.S. has offered. Dr. Forero and her work as the director of the unit is something that we have also joined, and we have the obligation of supporting her efforts. We have to continue in these efforts with the objectives that she and her team have affirmed to be able to build peace in this country. As Ambassador Peña said, who is in an official representation at COP16, he would like to extend his gratitude and support for the search to find the truth for all of those families who are searching justice in the country. Now, this is an act of gratitude on our behalf, and you have our partnership with this unit. Therefore, Steve, we'd like to thank you for your support, and once again, we appreciate the U.S.'s effort for helping us continue with our agenda to be able to heal people in Colombia and create that peace that all Colombians deserve and are searching for in Colombia. Thank you again.
Muchísimas gracias, Daniel. Ahora
Thank you so much, Daniel. I now have the honor to introduce you to the director, Janeth Forero, who is the director of the Missing Persons Search Unit. She's going to give us a summary presentation of the entire efforts of the Missing Persons Search Unit. We will also have a 10-minute short video of the documentary that the unit published. Now, this short video is going to address the story of Daniela Mostacilla. She's here with us today, and she's going to, on our panel, be also on our stage today. Like Daniel said, we're going to have the great honor to hear the reflection to conclude from Ambassador Van Schaack, who has been a great defender of these efforts, as well as a champion of the work and support of restorative and transnational justice in Colombia. Now, Janeth has a story to share. She has been working and dedicating her time to these efforts for the last 30 years. She was a surgeon, and then she did a PhD in the University of Externado in law, and she's worked with a series of public and private institutions, including the children's agency in Colombia, as well as institutions that address the women equity. In 2019, she was nominated or assigned as the first female director in one of these institutions, where she was able to advance in her career, and she continues to work in this field, and she's been the director of the Missing Persons Search Unit for the last 18 months. Director, thank you so much. Please come forward. You have the floor.
Bueno, muy buenas tardes.
Good afternoon, everyone. We truly appreciate you being here today, especially in the efforts that we're carrying out. It's a pleasure to share the agenda that we've been carrying out, and thank you, Steve, especially, because we started talking about this project 1 year ago, and now we're finally here, bringing everything together that we had imagined. And I'd also like to acknowledge the victims in our country. They cannot be forgotten, especially women who have given their life to find missing persons, loved ones. Their persistence and resilience have pushed us to do different things every single day, especially with this hope for reparation, which is the search for missing persons. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible, and like the ambassador said, what we've been addressing is the humanitarian search for missing persons. Now, this humanitarian search includes a very complicated context. We're searching for 111,600 people, and no one on this earth is looking for this many. 50% of these are registered, and so the magnitude is even greater. This is a very diverse group of people that we're looking for. It's not like in the Southern Cone where the population was very similar. Here, these people are very diverse. It's happened in the 80s and in this past century. These have been people executed by different people in different territories of the country, in urban spaces and rural spaces. And so that diversity of the people that are missing makes it even harder. We have a gorgeous, diverse, dispersed country that in some areas is not well connected. The beauty of Colombia is actually, in fact, also an obstacle to finding missing persons. Even in terms of the genetic analysis, the armed conflict. Colombia has 8 still pending armed conflicts. Within these conflicts is why this humanitarian search began. There's a limited capacity for the search. Colombia does have a great forensic capacity, but when addressing this huge group of people that we're looking for, we also face obstacles. In the context of the peace agreement is when the search for missing peoples begins. The peace agreement and the search for truth in the framework of a comprehensive system for peace. So this arises from the victims, this need for the search. Why? Because the judicial search that was being carried out in Colombia from the beginning of the century, even from the last century, at no point considered the victim's perspective. And so this perspective, which is transitional, carried out by the Colombian government, has been going on for 20 years. It's something unprecedented. And we can look at many similar scenarios, but none of these compare to the Colombian search. And so this missing person search unit, which is characterized by a humanitarian aspect, understanding the humanitarian aspect first. It's about looking for and finding the missing persons to alleviate that suffering, especially felt by women and families who have been searching for more than 30 years. So that humanitarian aspect shows that we're a neutral institution and we're also independent and impartial. And so how do we see that impartiality? Well, that we're looking for every single person with no exceptions. It's very important to find members of the civil society whose social leadership has been lost. It's as important as finding members of certain groups, since right now we're looking for more than 500 people from that group. We're looking for people from the FARC, people, part of the paramilitary groups. So there's no stigma, no discrimination, no bias in terms of our search. And we're extrajudicial because we're looking for people, not for people who are guilty. And so this is the difference. We're looking for missing persons. That's it. And none of the efforts that we carry out lead to any sort of process legally. This is another great advantage, that we can converse with any actor that's been part of the conflict. Anyone who has been a perpetrator of acts. And I'm careful with this language because, of course, our humanitarian aspect also sets certain limits. We right now have specific search routes. More than 3,200 people who are contributing with information for us to be able to create these search routes so that we can collect data, we can go to the fields, the sites in person. There are more than 1,000 forensic sites that we're looking at in Colombia, which we've been more than 10,000 rather, not 1,000, to verify whether they're truly there. And this has also been possible due to the leadership that we've had, as well as the group effort that we've made with other institutions. Being extrajudicial doesn't mean being anti-judicial, and this allows us to work with the Institute of Peace, the General Attorney's Office, and other entities of the state.
We are confidential because, just to say it simply, often what we do doesn't necessarily serve the judicial system, but we ensure that people can overcome the fear that they've had, historically speaking, to approach institutionality with the state and make reports if they are missing someone or if they know where someone might be, in order to further a search and further compile information. For example, there are a little bit, I think it's been more than 7 years that we've been operating as a missing persons search unit, and we've had over 8,000 comments from individuals who never approached the police or any other institution because of fear, because of anxiety, discrimination, stigma that go along with having missing persons in your family or being a missing person. The work that we do is technical, scientific, but above all else, it is a human effort. And so, as part of our search for missing persons, we incorporate the knowledge and ancestral traditional practices of many communities that have learned to seek out such methodologies, and those have been used in our search. That is what further facilitates this being a reparative process, because our principle is that the search must repair, it must fix. And we have a very concrete mission. We want to direct, coordinate, and contribute to the implementation of humanitarian search actions for missing individuals. We do lots of different focuses. We have territorial focuses, we have gender focus, we have an intersectional focus, we have an inclusive focus on an entire life cycle. We know that those who search today have been searching for so long that many of them are on the brink of their own death. Many of them suffer with other disabilities of their own. Many of these individuals have essentially given their entire lives to finding these individuals, and they left everything else behind. And so that's why you see that many of them are living in poverty, they are in vulnerable situations, and rights continue to be violated in these communities. And we have occurrences that happened before December 1st of 2016, right? That was sort of our limit. Fortunately, in our country, we just created a national search system to bring answers based on the knowledge that the unit has put together for the disappearances that occurred after December 1st of 2016, which is sort of the framework for the setting of our peace agreement. Now, there are complexities to face when we look at how we define, in a classic sense, someone who has disappeared or is forced into being missing. And we look for people who have been forced into disappearance, according to a classic, I suppose, more universally adopted definition. But the conflict in Colombia was so complex, so difficult to deal with, so disparate, that many individuals did disappear in other contexts that were not necessarily by force. And so we look for people who disappeared because they were kidnapped. It's not a secret that kidnapping was one of the main ways that Colombian conflict was financed. And in that context, those who disappeared in the context of armed conflict, victims of kidnappings are targets of our searches. Those who are victims of recruiting, everyone recruited. There were people who were recruiting children, boys, girls into these wars. And we seek out the victims, and we look for those who are families to the individuals who were disappeared during this context. During military activity, there were bodies that were essentially spread out throughout all of Colombia's territory, and they were just left there. Sometimes they were buried in large graves. Sometimes they were thrown into rivers, etc. There were lots of settings where bodies were left, without highlighting that in Colombia, cemeteries are often a place where you're going to find an exaggerated amount of bodies. Now, how do we provide or deliver this function in a very diverse geography? This is one of the strategies we've been focusing on over the last year, because finding the missing persons can be done within territories, but also along with them. We have 28 working groups that are covering 8 different regions, and thereby they cover the entirety of Colombia's geography, including these at the bottom where we look at where we skirt along the Amazon. We still don't have groups that are really consolidated there, but we're looking for professionals in those territories so that we can promote searches there, so that we can start receiving requests to search, and we can have an influence, both political and otherwise, so that this can be a national effort, as we have been trying to achieve recently, and to increase our organizational capacity. Now, we are the result of the organized efforts of victims in our countries, but many victims are still not organized and require our presence and our assistance in order to continue the search together. Because part of our search is that the search be carried out hand in hand with organizations. Now, how do we carry out the searches in Colombia? Searches are a fundamentally technical scientific effort that require massive data compilation. You need a lot of forensic technology, and all of this is defined within a strategic document, which is called the National Search Plan. This document defines our priorities, how we're looking for people, where we begin, what criteria we make use of to define how we're going to approach a particular territory, a certain timeline, how we set up our investigative hypotheses. And that's why this plan sort of it plans out our national deployment, right? What the search must be like, and how we will collaborate with other state entities to define the role of civil society organizations' participation, and also what the role is for the international community to play in Colombia, which has been a driving force for our process. If it hadn't been for the international community, we wouldn't see the progress that we've made thus far. And at a national plan level, we define the methodological criteria that help us to define mass searches. As you can imagine, finding over 100,000 people one by one would be impossible. Recently, at the UN, someone said that if we found a single missing person, finding them one by one, it would take us 300 years to find everyone. That's time we simply do not have. And that's why mass search is our methodological strategy, which through connections, relations, interactions within the framework of different plans at a regional level, which later on I'll talk about, this allows for us to accelerate our search because one case often connects to another. And when you have disappearances in Colombia, you have to understand this was often systematic. And there were models, there were sort of MOs, ways for that to occur that were well established. And so this national search plan is broken down and consolidated into 92 regional search plans. These 92 regional search plans, for those of you who are familiar with Colombia, Colombia has 32 different departments and over 1,200 municipalities. Regardless, I do want to highlight here that the national or the regional search plan doesn't have a strictly politically divided or territorially divided strategy, because given that the conflict was so complex and there was so much diversity, including territorial diversity, these plans define bit by bit the dynamics, the context, the peculiarities within the diversity that I had highlighted recently. And these regional search plans, there are 92 of them, and they end up consolidating investigational hypotheses. A search plan could have 1, 3, 5 different hypotheses depending on the actors involved, depending on how many victims there are, depending on the historical moment you might be living through, the realities of the context where the victims were generated. That is what we're looking at with these disappearances. Now, in our particular case, with searches, we begin with compiling information within the framework of what we have called humanitarian searches in an extrajudicial context. Information compilation, that is the basis for the search. If we do not have information, we can't get anywhere. And that information comes from lots of different sources. I was just talking about the 1,640 individuals. This universe that we set up was created with 16 different sources of information. There were judicial sources, non-judicial sources, journalistic sources from the United Nations that undertook that historical research. The 111,640 individuals, that's something that really helps to elevate individuals in the search. And these requests that I've mentioned, we've got 30,000 of them practically now. And this is a major challenge in the sense that we have to reduce the major gap that we've seen between the amount of requests and the global amount of requests and the actual requests, the concrete ones we get. And this comes from bajillions, hundreds of millions, like so many different files, so many different cases. Some are structured, some are non-structured. We have organized databases, some that aren't as organized, and this leads us to collect information, basic data that allows us to carry out the humanitarian search. But it also helps us identify forensic locations. We are able to then go to those locations and carry out exhumations. Now, most of the time, unfortunately, the people that we find that we are looking for have died. They passed away. But something else that we have been highlighting in our country is looking for people who are still alive. The main principle for extrajudicial missing persons searches is that we want to try and find people who are still alive. And so we do all the cross-referencing, all of the analysis of the information that we bring together. Over the years, we have found that nearly 3,000 people in our country can still be found alive, or there is an indication that they are still alive, and so that is a major challenge to our search. After locating or recovering, we identify, which our country does within the legal medical institution, because most of the identification processes have to be done today through the genetic proof method. And through this method, today, we've seen major progress through the use of forensic methodology that we're implementing at cemeteries, where in many cases, we are even able to verify the correspondence of information right there in situ. We've been able to clarify to a great degree who it is we're finding, and deliver the remains in a culturally adequate way. And so all this to highlight that our search process often, although the whole process brings dignity, it recognizes the humanity in the person that we're looking for. It recognizes the efforts and the resilience of the families, and dignified delivery of remains often is the moment that people have been waiting on for such a very long time. And that's where people can start to let the scars heal over and the cycle of pain that they've been stuck in for a whole lifetime begins to close. And when we find the individual alive, we can do reunions, which, as we say in the documentary, are truly sublime moments when we get to find someone who is in fact still alive, and families didn't know that they were around for practically 20, 30 years. All of that, that's why in a cross-cutting way, we have participated by helping victims in differential perspectives. All of these individuals are victims in one way, shape, or form, but all of them are involved, is the thing. Now, constant challenges, finding people who are still alive, which I just highlighted, verifying corresponding information. The idea is that every single day, corresponding information and confirming things in situ is very important. Transnational or cross-border searches. Many of the individuals who have disappeared are buried in cemeteries in neighboring countries, especially in Venezuela and in Ecuador. Many of our missing persons are probably in some country throughout the region, or could even be in some country somewhere in the world. Some people are searching in exile. There are 169 people in Colombia that are currently being sought out by family members living in Europe. We know that there are many more of them, and it's very interesting that only from within the United States, there's only one person searching out in exile, just one, and we think that there's great potential there when it comes to spreading our mandate in that country, which is a migratory destination for Colombians, and which probably are unaware of this mechanism, and we need for that to activate here. Significant challenges. We are working in really complex scenarios. The Escombrera, which is literally a landfill that has been accumulating waste and trash for over, I think, 22, many more years, I think, in our country, in Medellin. And many of our missing persons are being sought out through the Orion operation. They're probably just stuck underneath there, beneath tons of waste and trash. We've been able to move 20,000 cubic meters of waste thus far. We're looking in trenches. We're looking in wells. Lots of people might be lost in there, and we're doing that for the sake of furthering the to further our search efforts. We're looking for people in the jungles. We're looking for people near the sea because people could have been thrown there at some point. And this is just to show we're doing everything possible. We are building roots with those who contribute with information. That is the 3,200 that I had mentioned previously, those individuals who are working to build this effort and are working decisively in our search. And so continuing, I think that just to express our thanks and say that we have to further strengthen our search for missing persons. We are constantly learning, and I say that it's a process where it's all trial and error, where successes and best practices that we define end up adding to the search, and day after day further promote our, well, I guess our results more than anything, and for our results to be at the end of the day relief, the end of pain and peace for those who are searching for their family members. Thank you so much.
Ahora tendremos el...
So now we will do a 10-minute viewing of Daniela Mostacilla's documentary. I'm an indigenous woman from San Lorenzo, that we're heading to the village of El Tarso, to the same reservation where my dad was buried. My father was missing for 31 years. He was a very well-known person on the land where I grew up. Let's say he had a reputation among the community, and they told me a lot about him. They spoke both good things and bad things. He was interested in making a family with my biological mother before he goes on the last mission, which is where he loses his life. He goes to a house. The lady tells me, your father came to change some corn for beans, and he tells her, take care of my mother, that when I return from the mission, I'm coming to make a family with her. He told her, my mother is a former combatant too. She leaves after 7 months of being pregnant, and when she finds out about my father's death, well, she abandons me in a daycare center. I grew up with a feeling of love towards a man who, although I did not know, I knew that in some way he wanted that I would be in this world. Daniela is a young woman with a very clear identity and a very clear fight for claiming her.
El papá de Daniela, siendo
Daniela's father, being very young and in very difficult conditions of country life, he entered to that armed group until the time of his death, being a combatant. When Daniela arrived, she had a community investigation. She had the stories of her family, some conversations that she had had a few years prior with her uncles, and we took that interview. We took some dates, so we systematized that information and we began to contrast it. And I began to realize that, indeed, there were press reports that gave information of the combat in which he would be injured and later killed her father. The dates coincided even from his birth, and we started searching databases with what could have been the identity of her father, because at the time Daniela only knew his alias. I started the search first on my homeland. So, for example, they told me, your dad, he always came to this house. That was the guerilla's house, and there they took him and he slept there and they gave him food. So I went there and started the search. The entire community knew already that I was his daughter, so I was not hesitant, and they told me about it. They said, yes, your father would come here, he liked to eat this. Here, everyone knew him as Miguel. But beyond that, we can't tell you anything else. The last thing we managed to hear from him, or about him, was that there was an attack to the police station nearby a place where they were living, in which, during the confrontation, he was injured along with 2 other people. Their bodies were recovered by the group they were part of. My family, particularly a sister, knew that I had the desire to find him. And precisely, her husband lives in that El Tarso village. And here she started working as a professor, and her father-in-law was part of that combat, and he helped to carry the wounded and the luggage and that baggage. Then I started to talk to him, and he tells me we have to talk to Don Jaime, because Don Jaime was the person who helped open those grave holes where they were buried. The information that communities have is absolutely fundamental to the search process. Someone heard something. Someone knows something. Someone can connect one part of the information to others. Concerning the search, there is no piece of data that should be neglected. No data can be seen as unimportant. We're currently in ancestral territory for Satatamaquiwe in Caldono municipality. Here, along this village, my research comes to an end. After walking all over so much of this territory and requesting information and compiling memories with elders who sought to remember what had occurred in July of 1991 concerning the combat that happened more or less close to where we're at right now, where my father perished. We're here out on the field where Don Jaime lives, the only elder still left alive who supported me throughout the process and who has been a major source of information to me. Don Jaime and Don Lucindo were unconditional sources of support for me because both of them were the only witnesses at the time that saw my father be brought and buried, etc. So I'm very fond of them because they assisted me through this process. And Don Jaime was with me until the end because he was there when my father was exhumed. She asked me what the burial was like. She said that was her father, and I said, yes. One day, the both of us headed over to take a look, but years had already passed by then. So you couldn't even see the land, you couldn't see the traces of the burials. After I compared, contrasted, discarded some options, every time I could, I would leave him flowers. I would go pick some flowers on the way, and I would spread them, and I would spread flower petals over what was his grave. We managed to find her father because she had done the work previously to find where the burial was, based on interviews she'd done among the community members. When she arrived at the office, she had a very specific drawing of the road that we needed to go down, how long we would take, and what issues we might face, because back then, there was an armed actor there, and there were lots of security issues that the team faced. Many years of searching, investigating, talking to people, contrasting information. Later, we arrived at the El Tarso cemetery. This is where my father was buried for 31 years. With the help of Don Jaime, we drew a sketch. He drew what the entrance to the cemetery was like. He took a picture. She took a picture that later we were able to use geospatial referencing to locate. There was a pine tree used as a reference point, and before all those concrete vaults were there was just the one. And what we did was basically define a polygon, right, a sort of area within which the burial might have occurred. Essentially 30 meters to the right of the pine tree, that's where my father might have been buried. Daniela's work was important because we could use that as a starting point to coordinate a location with the forensic team, which is a scientific process that we can use to determine a hypothetical location for where that person might be. Such an exercise was carried out later on in a prospecting visit with the forensics team. And the first reunion I had with him was finding his skeleton in the hole. It was very traumatizing and painful because I already knew what had happened to him. But I didn't understand the inhumane conditions I would find him in. Finally, we were able to bring relief to her and end the anxiety that Daniela was experiencing. I felt like I could finally rest and grieve him, that I could sort of have him with me in a way. I mean, not the way you hope, because when you're searching for someone, you hope to find them alive. But at least this way, we're close. Marcela was a phenomenal guide to me, honestly. I believe that thanks to her, the whole concept of a dignified delivery of remains can be carried out successfully. John Sawal was the person who helped me the whole time, conducting the entire information review process to put memories together, carry out interviews, see what details we could put together to confirm information we already had. And I think that their help, beyond just being the professionals in the process, they were they gave me a degree of humanity. And I think they knew that he was a guerrilla member, but they never stigmatized him. Whenever they talked to me and helped me, they said, the girl is looking for her father.
Bueno, es un gran privilegio.
What a privilege to have Daniela here with us after having shown this documentary displaying her search process, which she began and initiated herself. But we also have representatives on the panel on the cultural adaptation of the search at a community level, and also when it comes to remains delivery. I want to start with a question for Daniela, but also for our other colleagues concerning the process and what the process was like for the both of you. What did it mean for there to be an absence of the indigenous community? There is often a lack of closure. There's pain. What does that mean for you guys, and what was it that the unit did in bringing remains back in a way that is dignified? We want the process to be dignified. So let's begin with Daniela. Yes, your mic is already hot. We'll begin with Daniela, and then we'll discuss the indigenous and the Afro aspect to the question. Well, first off, good afternoon. I want to thank USIP for inviting me. I am 33 years old. That means that I have been undergoing this process for 20 years. I never imagined that this would be everything in my life for 20 years. My father's life made no sense to a lot of society as a combatant. And disappearances in Colombia, this happens a lot before, this happens far before a physical body disappears. The thing is that there's such disconnection between the state and the territories that we often don't know where a lot of people are. My father is one of the individuals who doesn't appear in the National Registry of Missing Persons. So before my father disappeared in the framework of the armed conflict, he didn't even exist to the state and the government of Colombia. And cases like these are incredibly common. This is a daily occurrence, and so I think that it's an honor for us to be here, and for me especially, so that we can acknowledge all those who search for ex-combatants. We want to remind general society that despite their bad decisions, they are still human beings, and they have a right to heal their pain and their wounds along with their family, and we can't implement a double standard where young people are involved in conflict and they automatically lose their youth. We can't allow them to lose their lives in such atrocious ways. And continuing with the question that Steve asks.
In terms of the missing persons on an indigenous territory, it usually happens on an individual level, but this is not the case for us. Every single person in the community, in our community, has a role, a collective role. And so when somebody leaves our community, is gone from our community brutally, this is huge for us, because for us, all of that community processes, everything they contribute to the community disappears. And so in terms of our community, the feeling, that sense of community goes beyond just what happens in daily life. It's a deeper grief. And I think you were able to see that in the documentary. Despite everything that's happened to us and caused us so much pain, we never blame people through stigma. Because everyone from our land continues to always be part of us and part of our land, independently of the decisions that they have taken. Instead of, or rather, in terms of the search, we've been doing this very differently. Because this unit, this entity, has a respect for ethnical groups and others. In this sense, we actively participate within the investigation process, identification, and the return of the remains. Because when we receive those remains of our loved people, we have the right to decide how we want to receive those remains, depending on our customs, our traditions. This is a sign of respect for us. We also highlight our rights as victims. And I don't really like that word, victims, because I feel it restricts the panorama of the armed conflict in Colombia. I'd prefer to say people who have suffered through this in Colombia. And so they have the space to participate more efficiently. People who have been harmed, who have suffered, for us to have a political and active participation. The unit has made it possible for us so that we don't have to look for the state, look for the governor who's going to, or the government that's going to help us find the missing persons. Instead, they've taken account our cultural diversity. Not only does this allow us to participate, so that we also learn. For example, previously people would have to go to the capital city to create and open a report. They would have to submit themselves to DNA tests, blood tests. And now people who are considered leaders in a community are now allowed to facilitate the information that's obtained and begin this process. Now in 2016 is when the peace agreement came about, and Colombia has not overcome the armed conflict. In fact, the armed conflict we're looking at now is even worse than what we saw before 2016. However, this isn't a barrier to us, for us to say we need to continue in our search. And so now we're looking for strategies that will allow for us, people in our own communities and territories, to mobilize to be able to search for the missing persons. Now, we who carry out these searches, usually we're women. There are about 200,000 women searching for missing persons in Colombia. And we are in constant communication with the Missing Persons Search Unit. However, there are some limitations, and we have Daniel here. I'd like to send you a message. The peace agreement within its discourse is focused on the victims, but we want to receive that focus but still be able to participate. If there's something we're sensing is that certain rights are not being fulfilled. We want to be able to monitor the process, to be able to, from our experience, be able to contribute to these efforts. As searchers, we demand certain things. We want to have effective participation, which is affected by a budgetary issue as well. And we hope that this government, in contrast to the terms we've seen in the past, will allow us to see that greater support. Thank you, Daniela. Would like to speak more about the victimization, the view, how victims are viewed. Lena, from your experience, this process adaptation to the remains, your own family members, what has your experience been in the massacre from May in 2002? Thank you, Steve. Welcome, everyone. Thank you, Janeth, and thank you to the search unit for your arduous work. Congratulations, Daniela, as well. I'm here in solidarity. I'd like to acknowledge your courage. I've been there. I know it's not easy. And some of the scenarios we just saw are just a few. In 2002, we lost 96 people. According to the data we have, it's 102 people we lost, in fact. This massacre, in the midst of everything, we were not able to recover any of the bodies. Our main goal was to save lives. And so, with a shovel, we picked up our loved ones and put them in bags. Imagine a bomb through just a small tube falling on the ground here and destroying everyone in this room. And I'm sorry I'm saying it this way, but imagine our arms, our bodies splattering on the walls. This is what we had to pick up. And this is something that had never happened before. That we had to pick up our loved ones, put them in plastic bags. This was something that was very difficult to face in Wali and La Morena. And with these rituals, we expect people to go to heaven and turn into angels. We weren't able to carry out our ritual with these loved ones. 16 years goes by, and we knocked on the doors of the Colombian government, and I can give you a list of all the meetings that we participated in, all the tours we went on to knock on those doors, different institutions, so those spaces would open for us to be able to identify bodies. And throughout all those 16 years, we weren't able to do so. With all our meetings with the Attorney General, they would say to us, okay, 79 people died during the massacre, and we said, no, that's not right. They buried the bodies of our family members with numbers, crosses, and they put it right next to the river, as close as possible to the river. And we would worry about the river, the level of the river going up and completely covering the bodies of our loved ones. In the framework of the peace agreement, when the FARC decided to speak to the government, we said this is an opportunity for us to really be able to address our rights, and we approached this conversation with a lot of hope. And what we did was to exacerbate these efforts so that we would have a peace unit, a space, an institution that would be in charge of searching for missing persons. For me, the hardest part was listening to Maria Pascuala's testimony, who would say, every night my mother comes to ask for water. When one of us dies and comes in our dreams to ask for water, it's because they're suffering. And so this massacre had caused suffering for our loved ones and victims during 16 years. That identification process was extremely painful, extremely anguishing. And after the massacre in 2019, however, we were able to finally rest. We were able to extract the remains, 3 years of anguish, and today we've placed them in a place that we call mausoleum, where they are resting in peace. And even during that process, we were able to find one person who was not part of our community. We picked them up and we took them to the same place we took our loved ones. We feel very relieved today, and this comes to show that the experience that we had, we would just like to share this with the rest of society. For the parts of society that still need to go through this process to also have that opportunity to bury their loved ones. Thank you so much. In another conversation we had previously, we were talking about budgetary cuts. And the state was saying to slow down that search. How do you respond to the urgency and the moral imperative after so many years of agony for victims and family members? How do you do exactly the opposite? Speeding up that search. You even mentioned one of the people that you found that wasn't part of your community. What do you do to speed up that search and address that relief for family members? Well, there's something that we've been trying to cement in terms of the ethical considerations in our institution, and it's related to how many years have passed. And this is very interconnected to women, sexual violence that has occurred. It's the same analogy. And why is the search so urgent? First, because every day that goes by is one day less that we have for the job that we do, but also one less possibility, because it's one more day that passes that evidence is destroyed, is lost. One day less that we're able to act. And so that's important to us. And it's also important to remember that the search is diverse. That diversity is meant for, has a higher purpose rather. So it's interconnected to the cycles of life, diversity, and it affects the processes. Now, processes are not linear. We always think we have to recover, identify, acknowledge. Once we understood that this process can be more cyclical, let's say, for example, we can start by finding a body of a missing person without knowing at all who this person is. But this is where the multidiscipline needs to come into play. The knowledge of what needs to be applied during the search, that has been key for us. In addition, we have to be hands-on with our searches. For example, when we started saying at the unit that everybody had to take biological tests, because this is completely restrictive, let's say the only people that can take these tests are, or exams are doctors, but We just saw the pandemic that passed recently, where we ourselves would administer tests to be able to check if we had COVID. And so that's the same thing we did for blood tests. There's certain people whose blood test we don't have in our database to be able to identify missing persons. So not every single person can knock on the government's door to be able to solve a problem. It has to be institutions that can connect the government with the local communities, that can go into the locals, that can receive requests, receive information, carry out projects, that can reach conclusions. After December 2016, for example, as well, these efforts were just had a huge increase. So we're carrying out these projects and offering these resources to these families. And we've been doing this hands-on. Very recently, we launched a strategy, which is the inverse search. Because we know that the state, and we know who these missing persons are. They've been identified. But the thing is, they didn't know where they were so that they could be returned to their families. So we're looking inversely, because we're looking for the families now. So this has been a massive communicative process using digital resources to be able to reach the mountains of Colombia. And we've found 18 different families so far. So it's really about how do we speed this up? How do we give it the importance it has and make it urgent in this world of missing persons? And previously, people didn't want to talk about missing persons. So we must do something ethical, in my opinion, that we have to say, okay, missing persons are related to you and to you, because everybody can contribute from different points of view. And so how do we call them to action? And just recently in this international event, I was also referring to this dynamic between the information that's shared in Colombia. For example, I was told in Chile this is unthinkable. In Chile, society will never accept using or presenting a victim, and I'm sorry, I'm using the word victim again, but they'll never take that. So it's not only using the information that somebody has, but also how that information creates different relationships and creates solidarity. The true peace, true restoration comes from several spaces. And so we have to be creative, find new ways of carrying out our projects and our actions, and recognizing the urgency of finding missing persons. Now that we're in the topic of contributors, I believe we have Cesar Maldonado online. He purged a sentence of about 10 years for violation of human rights. He came out as acknowledging that he was responsible for many of these actions, and he's been a leader in the entire country, calling upon people from who were formerly part of the armed forces. It's unfortunate that he can't be here in person, but he is joining us virtually. Cesar, from the armed forces, what has it meant to you to be able to contribute and to help heal those wounds in Colombia? Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you can hear us well. Hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, Steve, for inviting me to this space. Unfortunately, due to immigration, me not being able to travel, I'm not able to be there in person, but I'm very happy to be here remotely. As you said, in Colombia, the state was avoiding responsibility for things that happened during the armed conflict. These are facts, things that happened and that many times people don't want to face or assume responsibility for. So there was an abandonment and of just a neglect on behalf of the state for the conduct that was carried out. These people needed to be led, and I assumed this responsibility even though it wasn't up to me. And these efforts have continued over time. Over time, I've also been able to release this responsibility into the state who should really be in charge of this. I've been looking at public responsibility, especially when it comes to the peace agreement. The search for missing persons was a topic that really scared the public institutions. Now, this is a humanitarian issue that isn't going to have legal consequences. And sometimes people responsible of crimes and atrocities don't assume the responsibility because they fear having to face the consequences. And so what we've done is create a really good alliance with the Missing Persons Search Unit. First with Miss Luz Marina Sol, later on Luz Janeth Forero came on board, and what she has done is meet with us, the leaders of the Unit of Reconciliation, to listen to us, to stretch out a hand, to create alliances. And that happened as soon as she was nominated. She hadn't even stepped up to the podium yet, and that meant very much to us. We've worked with a missing person search unit. We have been able to open 14 workshops where former perpetrators participated. We were able to really wake or spark that interest for the topic, but also training the people who participated so that they could have access to this information that wasn't necessarily bad or toxic information, rather to look or consider as well that constitutional right for protection in terms of in this context. Through these workshops, we were able to sense, or rather talk to these former people, and they helped us identify and find missing persons. The people that showed interest in participating have allowed us to identify missing persons. We're carrying out great projects with the search unit, and I'd really like to commend the director, Janeth. She's really worked with us, especially as former army officers. And we have more than 1,400 representatives from the public force or public officers who have been able to share information. And I'm sure that that information will continue to help us find the missing persons. There are still family members that are waiting to find their loved ones who continue to wait and watch to see if they're able to find them. With the peace agreement, what we would like is for the search unit to be able to take advantage of technological and digital resources. In addition, with international collaboration, we're also going to be able to find more information of the information that we're looking for. Thank you so much. This really shows the importance of working together, especially on an international level. I know that these efforts are not easy, especially with the stigma and the obstacles that you have mentioned with the public officers or former public officers. I'd like to ask one last question. Cesar? Yes, I'm so sorry to interrupt. This is basically a very unique case, especially compared to other armed conflicts in the world. For public officers to come together to really carry out this huge effort to find missing persons in the framework of the peace agreement. They've had to assume a huge responsibility to find missing persons. I really wanted to highlight this, the arduous work that the unit has been carrying out to find missing persons. They really need international support and collaboration for the search. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Cesar. I'd like to ask Daniela one more question, and after that we'll hear the concluding remarks from Ambassador Van Schaack. Daniela, I'd like to ask you the following question about your family. You mentioned at a certain point that your son, Sebastian, who's 10 years old, that you committed yourself to showing him the truth that your family has faced. Committing to healing and closing those wounds for that not to happen again. That's something that you've promised to yourself and your family, especially in the region of Cauca that is facing armed conflict. Tell us about that personal commitment to avoid further conflict in the future and in your department, in your state of Cauca. Well, before addressing that question, I'd just like to mention that the search is much more extensive. For example, right now, we know that recently we've been searching people that we don't even know. I didn't even know my father, in fact. I never met him. I was never able to meet him personally, and so I grew up without my biological family. However, I felt that I had a different perspective, and I wondered, why am I different to the people that I'm growing up with? Well, it's really related to identity. What I wanted to see is what he was like, reconstruct him, know what his tastes are, for example, and that helped me in terms of my identity. And meeting with my biological mother when I was 14 years old also allowed me to develop my identity and really establish my identity after knowing what she was like, what she liked. And in terms of what Steve is saying is that there's a intergenerational conflict. Unfortunately, this conflict that we're seeing in Colombia is really a hereditary issue that, let's say, someone's cousin was a guerrilla, and so the entire family also, from one generation to the next, turns into guerrilla. There was the guerrilla officer Pascuas, for example, who took away my father. He approached my father, said, please help us with X, Y, and Z, and at that time, my father was 8 years old, and so he becomes part of this group. And later on, my mother is also taken away. And then my mother decides to leave me behind because she knows that with my father having died, she would have to return to the front lines, but without the support of my father, she wasn't going to be able to take care of me. And so, after all this armed conflict, I enter into the front lines and the militia, which is a group of civilians that works towards their own agenda. And the FARC, for example, also recruits underage people because it was so much easier to be able to control them, train them, and it would be very different to recruiting somebody that's an adult and part of the civic force. They would take a young girl, for example, who was alone. They would manipulate her, lie to her, and make her think that they were the saviors. And so this group of young people that was manipulated, and I was part of this, I finished my high school, and after that, I escaped to be able to travel to a larger city in Colombia and get my life back. My son, whose name is Juan Sebastian, well, I've committed to or promised to him that his life will be different. My son is 10 years old. He doesn't sleep alone. He's scared of the darkness. And so I would ask, sometimes I would wonder, what about my father? What happened to him when he was 8 years old? He was completely alone. Nobody would embrace him, hug him, take care of him. So breaking that chain has been very difficult, but I'm trying to do that, achieve that through my son. And even telling my father in my head, my son's life is going to be different. This chain is going to be broken. And to be able to tell my son, this is our story. This is our family, and it's hard, but there's this commitment that I've personally made that things are going to be different. I'm certain that I'm going to do everything possible so that my son isn't part of that conflict. Thank you, Daniela, for sharing that very personal story and that very moving story as well. It's very inspiring for families and communities that still continue to suffer in many parts of Colombia. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time on our agenda to receive questions, but you will have time after this session to ask questions. You're able to speak to Janeth and Daniela. I'd now like to invite the Ambassador Beth Schaack, who is the Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice at the Office of Global Criminal Justice. Please share some words and tell us what you know about the Colombian experience. Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here. I'm going to be speaking in English because my Spanish is a bit limited.
Including me in this gathering, and I really appreciate the remarks of the panelists, their courage to engage in this conversation, and particularly want to acknowledge Cesar. It's good to see you. I hope you remember me from a trip to Colombia a while ago. the willingness to face trauma and to articulate trauma, and to present and in your dedication to the search for truth and for healing. I really enjoyed meeting some of you in Bogota, and I enjoy our engagement with the various elements of the transitional justice system. Thank you to USIP for bringing together this really important, if somber, conversation and this incredible photo exhibition so that we can all share our reflections on this emotionally difficult issue. In facing its daunting mission, Colombia has really exhibited a remarkable history of coalescing different communities together around the need to address a long history of violence and injustice. This is reflected in the Peace Accord of 2016 that we've heard about, but it's really an unprecedented challenge of more than 50 years of conflict and all of the different types of violence that were committed during that period. The transitional justice framework that has been established by virtue of the 2016 Peace Accord is a complex ecosystem. It includes the Missing Persons Search Unit we've heard about, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the Truth Commission on which Leonard served. Each element of this ecosystem has to be in equilibrium for the entire system to work. And resolving the cases of the missing and the disappeared is an essential element of this ecosystem. The objective of the whole system, as I remember one magistrate of the HEP, as the Special Jurisdiction for Peace is called, he described it to me as trying to repair that which cannot be repaired. With every step devoted to this impossible ideal, these elements of the truth and justice system bring Colombian society closer to healing. Seeking truth lies at the core of the search for the disappeared, for without this truth, those cases cannot be resolved. Decades ago, Dr. Pauline Boss first coined a psychological term of ambiguous loss, and this to me really captures the state of being of those who suffer because their loved ones are missing or disappeared. Without this sense of closure, they're not able to address the pain that they're feeling and to put that pain behind them and to move forward into a new future. These unresolved circumstances, this lack of information about what happened to a loved one, causes our minds to work to fill in those gaps, and inevitably it goes to places of terror and of violence. And so trying to resolve these situations of ambiguous loss is exactly what the Search Unit for Missing Persons is undertaking. And I want to acknowledge how difficult it is for all Colombians who played different roles during the 60 years of conflict, how difficult it is for them to participate in this process and the courage that it takes to come forward. The Search Unit is undertaking remarkable work that we can now visualize through these photographs, but also through the film that will be on a continuous loop here at USIP. It's an essential element of this ecosystem, working top-down, also bottom-up, and across the whole diverse communities that make up Colombia to carry out the exhaustive search for the disappeared and the missing. We've heard from our panelists this evening of how all-consuming this work can be. It can take years, even decades, to resolve some of these cases. And it has, as we've heard so poignantly from Daniela, it can have an intergenerational impact, not just on particular families, but on society as a whole. We know that there are new reports of missing persons that emerge every year. In fact, Daniela was saying her father did not appear on any of these lists, even though these lists are now more than 100,000 persons. And this is happening within all communities of Colombia, but also now we're learning within the diaspora elsewhere. With this truth-taking taking place under very sensitive conditions, since the remains of those who have been buried after their disappearance are often spread throughout the country, and in areas of unimaginable geographic complexities. If you've ever been to Colombia, you know how diverse the various communities are in terms of the physical layout, the environment in which these teams are having to work. As evidenced by the work of the unit, these transitional justice institutions must put family members at the center of their work in pursuit of a trauma-informed and survivor-centered pathway to collective healing. Colombia is among the countries with the highest number of disappeared persons from the conflict, and it's important to see that each search involves a very tailored and bespoke process, often being co-created with family members themselves, like Daniela, who have done their own searches informally through their networks within their communities in any way that they can in order to contribute to this process of resolution. The needs of the families will vary, the needs of the different communities will vary, and so that's why the work of the search unit is so important in the way that it has embedded itself within the different communities across Colombia. It's particularly complex as well, given the diverse cultural, religious, ethnic traditions associated with death and dying, and the desire of the search unit to respect and to advance those preferences of the communities in which they are working. The United Nations Committee on Enforced Disappearances, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, the Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances have all concluded that the search for disappeared persons is a duty and an obligation of the state. And the search for disappeared persons and criminal investigations of those responsible can be mutually reinforcing. We've obviously heard today about how this is a humanitarian imperative. Individuals working within this part of the transitional justice system are motivated by these humanitarian concerns, but this work is also being carried out in close cooperation with other elements of the transitional justice system, and there may be circumstances in which the outcomes of some of these cases can feed into and inform the work of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace and other criminal investigations that are underway. I'm really proud that the United States has been a supporter of this work, the whole system of transitional justice, including being the accompanier of the ethnic chapter of the peace accords, but also providing direct support to the various elements of the transitional justice system. We've provided a whole range of technical assistance to the search unit. We've helped to develop the participatory national search plan that we heard about that was released in 2020 that is guiding this humanitarian effort and ensuring the continuous collaboration of those who have suffered and their communities in which they're living. We've also helped to identify staff and to support regional plans in various parts around the country, trying to also help increase the forensic capacity of the search unit to collect DNA samples, both reference samples and samples from those who have been exhumed, and also working in close coordination with the National Institute of Forensics to help identify the remains and to return them to their loved ones. Our United States Agency for International Development has worked to ensure victims' participation in these search efforts, and we have a number of projects going with the Special Jurisdiction for Peace to strengthen its efforts in this regard. We've worked in particular cemeteries to help with exhumations and to also help connect the samples that have been recovered with a larger database in order to help identify those who were found within those common or collective graves. And finding these points of intersection with other parts of the transitional justice ecosystem is one of the ways that we keep the system in equilibrium. In closing, I really want to commend the film. I watched it yesterday evening. It's a moving account of the work of several families working in partnership with the search unit in the search for their loved ones. It's also a really beautiful portrayal of the dedication of those individuals working within the search unit, Luz and her team, as they're conducting the painstaking work in partnership with those who have suffered from disappearances and the missing. It's also about a state-of-the-art science and technology that is being developed, and then basic human connections and empathy in designing victim-centered responses to these profound injustices that were caused by the more than 60 years of war. And Daniela's closing point in the film about how the communities received her as a young woman who was looking for her father. That's ultimately what this is about. It's not about who you were, what role you played. It's about bringing closure to those families. And so I'm really I've really been honored to be a part of this gathering. I've learned so much from our panelists, and I pledge to continue to look for ways for the United States and the rest of the international community to support this complex ecosystem of transitional justice within Colombia, but also to share what you have learned and what you are accomplishing in Colombia with other societies who are confronted with similar challenges as they emerge from situations of armed conflict and repression. So with that, I thank you for including me in this conversation, and I look forward to speaking with everyone at the reception.
Embajadora, muchísimas gracias. Estábamos haciendo la cuenta con Luz Janeth.
Ambassador, thank you so much. It's been $2.5 million that the USIP has contributed to the unit. That's what we were just talking about with Luz. I'm sure that you have many allies, but I hope that you consider us, the US government and USIP, as part of your allies. And finally, to give you just an example, that Lena, in the process with the FARC, you insisted so much to create this process for peace, for that to be created and to continue. Those spaces can have a direct impact so that the search can intensify in the future for the peace process and to support the unit in its efforts. Thank you so much for your interest. Thank you for being here today. We'd like to invite you to join us with Ambassador Van Schaack and our panelists to look at the exhibition out in the hall that's going to be here for about 7 weeks. Please join us for all of you who'd like to bring your family or students to come at a later date. It's under the leadership of the Colombian Embassy here in Washington, D.C., and it's very inspiring in the search for missing persons. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. Thank you so much. Please join me in applauding Janeth and Daniela and Cesar and Lena. Thank you so much to our panelists.